Cold open. A bitter winter gripped the Virginia countryside. Snow blanketed the fields, the rivers were frozen, and most families huddled close to their hearths for warmth. But in a quiet stretch of farmland, the Sullivan estate stood in eerie silence. To the townsfolk, Constance and Ezra Sullivan were God-fearing, charitable souls, known for taking in orphans, for offering bread to the poor, and for welcoming travelers in need. Their home was spoken of as a place of kindness. And yet, something about it unsettled those who passed by. Neighbors whispered of shadows moving in upper windows long after the lamps were extinguished. A merchant claimed he heard faint cries when he delivered flour to the back door one evening. But these rumors were dismissed as tricks of the wind, the paranoia of winter nights. Until one snowstorm evening, Sheriff Thomas Crawford rode past the farmstead. He slowed his horse, listening. Beneath the howl of the wind came a sound so faint it might have been imagined. Metal clinking, like chains dragged across stone, followed by the muffled whimper of a child. The sheriff tightened his reins. Something was very wrong inside the Sullivan house. Background and setting. In the early decades of the 19th century, Virginia was a land caught between tradition and change. Plantations thrived, built on the labor of the enslaved, while smaller farms dotted the countryside. Families relied on church, trade, and reputation to define their place in the community. In such a world, appearances meant everything. The Sullivan family fit neatly into this image, or so it seemed. Ezra Sullivan, a man of stern expression and hard hands, was known as a farmer who worked his land with diligence. His wife, Constance, however, was the true heart of their reputation. She was spoken of as a pious woman, often carrying a Bible, often quoting scripture with a soft, unshakable voice. She opened her doors to children said to be orphans, those who had no one to care for them. Town records showed at least a dozen had been placed in her custody over the years, and no one questioned her generosity. Neighbors recalled how she smiled kindly in church, how she offered pies at Sunday gatherings, how she lowered her eyes in humility when praised for her good works. To the outside world, the Sullivans were a model family, godly, charitable, almost saintly. But in the quiet moments, when no visitors lingered, strange details emerged. Children rarely played in the yard. Curtains stayed drawn even in daylight. Deliveries of food and supplies were larger than what two adults could possibly consume, and yet no one pressed too deeply. After all, who would dare accuse a family so admired, so respected? To do so would risk ridicule, or worse, social exile. So, the whispers of missing children went unanswered. The smiles of Constance Sullivan remained unchallenged, and the truth stayed hidden, locked behind the cellar door. Suspicion builds. The first real unease began with sound. Jacob Stern, a traveling merchant, often delivered flour and dried meat to the Sullivan farm. One evening, as he unloaded his cart, he paused. Beneath the whistle of the wind, he swore he heard crying, soft, desperate, and far too many voices for a house of two. When he mentioned it to Constance, her smile never faltered. "The wind plays tricks, Mr. Stern," she said sweetly, handing him payment with steady hands. Yet as he left, the sound seemed to follow him down the lane, the faint clatter of chains. Others noticed peculiar things as well. A farmer riding home after dusk saw the flicker of a lamp in the cellar window, though the Sullivans insisted no one ever went below. A passing neighbor caught sight of a child's pale face in an upstairs window, only for the curtain to fall quickly into place. These fragments of suspicion floated through the town, whispered in taverns and churchyards. Still, few dared to speak openly. The Sullivans were untouchable, their good name stronger than any rumor, and so the voices of the children remained unheard, their pleas smothered by snow, by silence, and by fear. The sheriff's visit. By January of 1834, the rumors had grown too persistent to ignore. Sheriff Thomas Crawford, a man of stern principle, had heard them all: cries in the night, children's shadows in shuttered windows, and the merchant's tale of chains rattling beneath the floorboards. Most dismissed these stories as superstition. But Crawford, a former soldier hardened by war, trusted his instincts. Something lingered at the Sullivan estate, something that gnawed at his conscience. On a moonless night, with snow crunching beneath his boots, Crawford rode with his deputy, Samuel Webb, to the Sullivan farmhouse. Lanterns glowed faintly within, and smoke curled lazily from the chimney. To any passer-by, it was a picture of peace. Yet Crawford felt the air tighten as they approached, the kind of silence that hides behind walls. Constance Sullivan greeted them at the door. Her eyes were warm, her smile practiced, her hands folded piously as if in prayer. "Sheriff," she said softly, "what brings you on such a bitter night?" Crawford stepped inside. The home was tidy, a Bible resting open on the table, bread cooling on the stove. Ezra Sullivan sat nearby, his posture stiff, his eyes darting too quickly. The sheriff exchanged pleasantries, scanning the room with a soldier's eye. Everything appeared normal. Almost too normal. Then he noticed it. A door at the far end of the hall, bound with an iron lock. When Crawford asked casually about it, Constance's smile flickered, if only for a second. "The cellar," she explained. "We keep tools there. It's dangerous for children, so we keep it locked." But Webb swore he heard something. A faint metallic clink, followed by what sounded like a stifled sob. He froze, looking at the sheriff. Crawford's jaw tightened. He stepped toward the locked door. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "I'll need this opened." For the first time, Constance's calm exterior cracked. Her hand trembled as she reached for her apron. Ezra shifted uneasily, as though ready to intervene. The sheriff's voice hardened. "Now." And in that tense silence, the walls of the Sullivan home seemed to breathe. Behind that iron lock, the truth waited, cold, fetid, and screaming to be set free. Revelation, the basement. The cellar door groaned as the sheriff's boot struck the lock. Metal shrieked against wood until, with a final crack, the iron latch gave way. The air that escaped was heavy and damp, carrying with it the foul stench of rot, mildew, and something far worse. Sheriff Crawford lifted his lantern and descended the steps. Each creak of the wood echoed unnaturally in the silence until a faint sound rose from below. Whimpers, the clatter of chains, the shuffle of small feet. When the lantern's light finally reached the stone floor, Crawford froze. Dozens of children. Their eyes, hollow and sunken, reflected the flame like glass. Some were huddled together, trembling. Others sat slumped against the walls, too weak to move. Rusted shackles bound their wrists and ankles, lengths of chain bolted into the stone. Scratch marks scarred the walls. Desperate, frantic etchings from tiny hands that had tried in vain to escape. A girl, no older than 10, blinked into the lantern's glow. She staggered forward, chains dragging, and clutched Crawford's coat. With skeletal fingers, her voice cracked to a whisper. "Don't let her take us back." Behind him, Deputy Webb gasped, crossing himself. The sheriff steadied the child, forcing his own horror down as he counted the shadows. Not one or two, but dozens. He would later recall that number with disbelief. 47. 47 children, hidden beneath a house of prayer and charity. The stairs above came Constance's voice, sharp and commanding now, stripped of its practiced sweetness. "You have no right." Her mask was gone. What remained was cold, unrepentant. But Crawford no longer heard her words. His mind was fixed on the cellar, the stink of human misery, the fragile bodies shivering in the dark, the chains that clanked with every breath. This was no orphanage. This was a tomb, and the Sullivans, once praised as saints of the community, had been its keepers. Wider conspiracy. The rescue of the 47 children should have ended the horror. But as Sheriff Crawford and his men began their investigation, it became clear. The Sullivan basement was only the beginning. Among the damp stone walls, beneath piles of rags and rotting food, Crawford discovered a small wooden chest. Inside lay journals, letters, and ledgers written in Constance Sullivan's precise, elegant handwriting. At first glance, they appeared to be simple household records, lists of names, dates, amounts of money. But the sheriff quickly realized these were not records of charity. They were transactions. Each name belonged to a child. Some were marked with symbols, others with prices beside them. $20, $50, $100. Notes were written in code, but the pattern was unmistakable. The Sullivans had not merely imprisoned children. They had trafficked them, selling the weakest into servitude, the strongest into lives far darker. The letters told more. Correspondence between the Sullivans and distant buyers, wealthy men in Virginia, Maryland, even as far as Georgia. The network stretched beyond a single farmhouse. It was organized, deliberate, profitable. And it had operated in silence for years, hidden behind the mask of piety and respectability. One particular letter chilled Crawford to the bone. It bore a name he recognized, Judge Alistair Green, a respected figure in Richmond. The letter thanked the Sullivans for their deliveries, praising their discretion and efficiency. If true, this was not merely the crime of one family, but a stain that reached into the highest circles of power. As word spread, townsfolk who had once praised the Sullivans now turned pale with shame. How many had turned away from the whispers? How many had ignored the cries on the wind? Constance's Bible, always displayed proudly on her table, was found annotated with twisted justifications, scripture bent to excuse cruelty, verses twisted into commands for obedience. In the days that followed, survivors told fragments of their story. Some had been lured from distant towns with promises of shelter. Others had been purchased outright from desperate parents. All spoke of the same terror, being locked away, hearing their names reduced to numbers in Constance's cold, meticulous ledger. The farmhouse, once a symbol of charity, was revealed as the beating heart of a machine built on human misery. And for Sheriff Crawford, one truth grew clear. The Sullivans were not alone. They were merely one thread in a far larger web. Trials and fallout. The capture of Ezra and Constance Sullivan sent shockwaves through Virginia. For decades, the couple had been praised as examples of faith and charity. Now, they were paraded through the streets in chains. The very chains they had forced upon children. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, not in defense, but in rage. Mothers wept openly, fathers shouted curses, and survivors clung to each other, too weak to stand alone. The trial began in the spring of 1834. Newspapers from Richmond to New York carried the story, branding the Sullivans as monsters. But inside the courtroom, the proceedings revealed far more than the crimes of two individuals. Witness after witness took the stand. A merchant testified about strange deliveries and locked doors. Farmers spoke of pale faces glimpsed through windows. Survivors, though fragile, told the court of endless nights in the basement, of hunger, sickness, and prayers whispered in the dark. One boy described how Constance recited scripture as she chained them, telling them obedience was God's will. The words turned the gallery cold. Then came the evidence. The ledgers, the coded letters, the names of buyers. When Judge Green's name was read aloud, the room erupted. Whispers of conspiracy filled the air. Could it be true that respected officials had purchased children under the guise of orphan placements? Defense lawyers tried to dismiss the documents as fabrications, but the handwriting, the seals, the patterns were undeniable. Ezra Sullivan remained largely silent during the proceedings, his face grim, his gaze fixed downward. But Constance was defiant. She claimed she had saved the children from starvation, insisting the basement was a place of discipline, not cruelty. Her calmness in the face of overwhelming testimony unsettled even the hardest men in the room. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Both Sullivans were found guilty of kidnapping, false charity, unlawful imprisonment, and conspiracy. Ezra was sentenced to hang. Constance, whose influence was deemed even greater, was sentenced as well. The date was set, June 12, 1834. The morning of the execution, the crowd was immense. Witnesses claimed nearly the entire county had come. Some came to see justice, others simply to confirm the Sullivans were human and not demons in disguise. As the rope was placed around her neck, Constance smiled faintly, reciting verses under her breath. Ezra stood beside her, expression blank, as though resigned. When the trap doors fell, silence swept the field, followed by a roar of approval. For the first time, the children who had survived could begin to breathe freely. But the fallout did not end there. The ledgers forced further investigations. Several names of buyers quietly disappeared from public life. Resignations, sudden relocations, deaths shrouded in mystery. Officials denied involvement, but the whispers of a wider network persisted for decades. The Sullivan farmhouse was abandoned, its cellar sealed with iron. Locals claimed the cries of children could still be heard on cold nights, carried across the fields with the wind. Parents warned their children never to wander near the ruins. The Sullivans were gone, but the shadow they left behind lingered, a reminder of how cruelty can hide behind kindness, how evil can wear the mask of sainthood, and how silence can make an entire community complicit. Legacy and hauntings. The executions of Ezra and Constance Sullivan should have brought closure. But closure is a fragile thing. For the children who survived, for the town that had once worshipped the Sullivans, and for the generations that followed, the scars never healed. The farmhouse stood empty for years, its windows shuttered, its doors barred. Yet few dared to go near. Farmers plowing the surrounding fields swore they heard cries echoing on the wind. Thin, pitiful voices drifting from the cellar long after the chains had been removed. Some claimed to see small shadows moving across the windows at dusk, though the house had been deserted. Dogs refused to enter the property. Horses would rear violently if forced too close. In 1841, 7 years after the trial, the county ordered the house burned to the ground. But even fire did not silence the stories. Local children whispered of pale figures wandering the ruins, their wrists raw and bloody, dragging phantom chains. Travelers reported a woman's voice, soft, sweet, almost motherly, calling from the woods nearby. Those foolish enough to follow said they felt a sudden coldness, as though invisible hands had gripped their throats. For the survivors, life was not so easily mended. Many carried scars not only on their bodies, but on their minds. Some grew into adults who rarely spoke, haunted by nightmares of darkness, stone walls, and Constance's calm voice reciting scripture as she locked the chains. Others tried to rebuild, marrying, raising families of their own. But even then, neighbors recalled how they would cling to their children at night, terrified of losing them to unseen hands. The wider conspiracy uncovered in the Sullivan ledgers was quietly buried by officials. Though a handful of buyers were exposed, many names were struck from record. Judges, merchants, and men of influence vanished from public life, their roles erased. But whispers persisted that the Sullivans had not acted alone, that they were only one branch of a network too powerful to be fully destroyed. Historians today still debate the extent of that network. Some dismiss the stories as exaggerated folklore. Others believe the Sullivans were merely caught because they grew careless, while countless others escaped justice entirely. What cannot be denied is that the children found in that cellar were real, their suffering documented, their chains preserved as evidence. By the early 20th century, the Sullivan case had passed into legend. Writers and ghost hunters turned the story into cautionary tales. Locals treated the ruins as cursed ground. When the land was finally sold and rebuilt, construction crews unearthed rusted shackles buried deep in the soil. Work halted for weeks, as men swore they heard voices whispering beneath the earth. Today, the land where the farmhouse once stood is overgrown, reclaimed by forest. Tourists still come, guided by ghost stories and curiosity. Some leave with nothing but photographs. Others report far stranger things. Camera batteries drained, recordings filled with static punctuated by faint sobs, sudden icy winds in the heat of summer, and always the same refrain, children's voices calling out from nowhere, echoing in the trees. The story of the Sullivan family is more than a tale of cruelty. It is a reminder of how evil can thrive in silence, how kindness can be a mask, and how communities, through fear or pride, can become complicit in horror. The cellar may be gone, the house may be ash, but the cries of 47 children, chained in the dark, will never truly fade. They linger, they accuse, and they remind us that some ghosts are not bound to walls or ruins, but to memory itself.